Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to the Sex, Power, and Leadership online conference. This is Amy Jo Goddard, and today I am so super excited to introduce you to Jaclyn Friedman. She is one of our keynotes for this conference. This conversation promises to be thought-provoking, fierce, revolutionary. It will, I'm sure, open up your mind in all kinds of ways. So I'm so glad you're here, Jaclyn. Thanks for being a part of it.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I'm so thrilled to be part of it.
So let me tell you a little bit about her, and then we're going to jump in. Jaclyn Friedman is a writer, speaker, activist. She has been doing work for many, many years, and she popularized the yes means yes standard of sexual consent. This was one of her first books, and was one of Publishers Weekly top 100 books in 2009. And she also wrote What You Really, Really Want, which helped define the concept of healthy sexuality. Her brand new book, which is awesome. If you have not gotten your copy yet, you must get it, but we will be talking about some of it today, is Unscrewed: Women, Sex, Power, and How to Stop Letting the System Screw Us All. That's why we're here at this conference, actually. So I couldn't have said it better. Friedman is a popular speaker. She's appeared in major media outlets like the New York Times and on Nightline. And she also has a podcast called Unscrewed. And it was named one of the best sex podcasts by Marie Claire and also by Esquire. She's founder and former executive director of Women, Action, and the Media, where she led a successful hashtag FB rape, Facebook rape, campaign to apply Facebook's hate speech ban to content that promotes gender-based violence. And I can't wait to ask her about that. So, Jaclyn, I'm so glad you're here. There's so many things I want to talk to you about.
So much to talk about.
I know. Thank you. Thank you for your work in the world. Your books are incredible. They are part of my collection, and they should be a part of everyone's collection. You've really contributed so much to conversations that really have led up to what we're doing right now, like what's happening right now in our culture. So when I was organizing this conference and trying to figure out who I wanted to have speak, I knew I needed to talk to you because I feel like you've really laid a lot of groundwork for us. So thank you for that. I would love to just start by, it's like kind of the standard question I always get, but just so that people can get to know you a little bit if they're not familiar with your work. What brought you into this work and what really lit your fire about it? Because you are a very impassioned writer. I love your voice and I love all that you bring to it. So how did that happen for you?
I came into this work through the anti-sexual violence movement, which I was doing work on myself on campus way back many years ago. Even before I was myself sexually assaulted on campus, but that certainly made the issue front and center and real personal for me. And so I cut my teeth on campus doing anti-rape work and holding my school to account for the way they adjudicated sexual violence cases. And then after that, I just kept doing movement work. And there was a truism back then that you hear less now because it's more complicated than this, that was you heard all the time, which is that rape has nothing to do with sex. And that's true in the narrow sense in which it was originally coined, which is rape is not an act of sexual incontinence, right? It's not because somebody gets too turned on to control themselves. It's about power and dominance and a bunch of other factors. But at the time, it was so deeply entrenched, that idea, that you really couldn't talk about rape and sex in the same conversation. It was taboo in anti-sexual violence work. To the extent that when Jessica Valenti and I put out the call for submissions for Yes Means Yes, we heard from anti-violence people who were like, we're coming for you. Like, you can't do this. You can't talk about the sexual culture and rape at the same time. You're going to give people the wrong idea. And so for me, as I did the work in various iterations throughout the years, I really came to understand that it was just super wrong. It was a backwards approach, and that the movement for sexual liberation and the movement against sexual violence are actually the same movement, and you can't talk about one without the other. And I feel like that's the place where my work lives, is trying to make both sides see that they're part of the same movement.
Yeah. And I feel like more and more conversations are happening about that. I was just at the National Sex Ed Conference, and that was a big part of the conversation this year. But really, this idea is not a new idea. Carol Vance wrote in Pleasure and Danger. I mean, that was really the thesis of that collection, which is a really important collection for you all to know in terms of feminist history and sexuality. But yeah, in her essay, that really was the thesis of that essay, was that we can't be talking about sexual violence and not also talk about pleasure, and we can't be talking about pleasure and not also talking about violence. Like, we have to be talking about both because they are so interconnected. And hopefully there will be a day when they're not, but right now they are.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of, okay, in your new book, actually, there's so many things. Okay, in your new book, you talk about this concept of faux powerment, which I was just like, brilliant, so good.
Thank you.
So can you talk about what you mean by faux powerment? Because I think this is so related to these conversations about sexual liberation and what does that really look like? And I think a lot of people don't know.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't know. Look, faux empowerment at its root is the idea that we as women can just decide our way free, that we can take a class or buy a product or see a movie or whatever it is, and that we can just decide that we are sexually liberated. And the rest of the culture and all the systems and institutions we live in ultimately have no bearing, that it's up to us to free ourselves. And it's a super appealing message, right? Because the reverse, which is actually true, is a lot harder, which is that there are systems and institutions and individual people who are impinging our sexual freedom. And we can't just decide for that to not be true. We have to do deep, transformative social change work in order to be truly sexually free. So it's a really appealing idea. And you see it, I mean, you see it a lot in advertising. That's the easiest place to see it. The idea that, like, you just need to buy this deodorant so you can raise your underarm and feel powerful, or, you know, whatever the message is, right?
Right.
But, you know, everyone talks about Dove Real Beauty ads as sort of one of the iconic versions of faux empowerment. And it is. And one of the things I discovered in researching the book was that what those ads were for was cellulite cream, right? So they were selling this idea that, like, you could be sexy and beautiful and powerful in any shape, size, color, as long as you don't have lumpy thighs.
Right, with
Like,
the cellulite cream.
so there's always a catch with empowerment.
Yeah.
And in reality, you know, you can imbibe all the empowering messages you want, and still you might go out and some guy could make a pass at you and you could turn him down and he could shoot you dead, which is a thing that happens more often than we'd like to admit. Or the example that I think is the most clear from the book, which is a young woman who was having a lot of sort of body image issues. She didn't feel good about how she looked. And a friend of hers said, "Oh, you should do a sexy boudoir shoot and you'll see how beautiful you are." And she was like, okay. And she tried it and it worked, right? She did. She did this sexy boudoir shoot. She saw the photos. She felt great about herself. And that's usually where the faux empowerment narrative ends. But what actually happened after that is really important if we're going to understand what real sexual liberation looks like. Because what happened after that is she showed them to her boyfriend. He loved them too. Everything's great. But then they break up. He publishes them on the internet against her express wishes. She gets deluged with rape and death threats to the point where she was suicidal and didn't want to leave the house. Now, I hasten to say she is fine now. But until we change the cultural circumstances that led to the second half of the story, we can't really call ourselves sexually free. And I should be clear, and I'm hopefully on your show, you know, at this conference, it's clear I'm not against sexy boudoir shoots, right? Everyone should do one if they want to. But we can't confuse that with actual cultural power.
Yeah. Well, so what do you think sexual empowerment really is? And I know you like to talk about, like, the difference between sexual empowerment and sexual power.
Yes.
And I don't think a lot of people have much nuance around that. So what do you think it looks like?
The word empowerment, I just feel like, has been used for so many things that it's been emptied of meaning, honestly. I think what real sexual power looks like is that we have sovereignty over our own bodies and our own sexual decisions. And that as long as we're not hurting anybody, our sexual decisions are not restricted, basically. And that could be the decision that we don't like to have sex that much, or that we like to have all kinds of crazy sex. You know, it doesn't matter, right? That one sex act or sexual configuration is not more inherently liberating than the other. What's liberating is having genuine sovereignty to pursue the sex lives we want to pursue, free of shame, blame, fear, and, like, literal legal and violence ramifications.
What a world it would be.
I mean, it sounds so simple when I say it like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Should be a no-brainer, but we're pretty far from there.
Yeah. So you recently wrote this piece on the Aziz Ansari situation for Vox. So one of the things you said in that piece was teaching affirmative consent does something profound. It shifts the acceptable moral standard for sex, making it much clearer to everyone when someone is violating that standard. I would love to unpack this a little bit and talk about in affirmative consent, because that's a thing that you have really spoken about in your work. And I think college campuses right now are really grappling with it, and sometimes it's really made fun of. It's just like, oh, you're supposed to be like, can I touch you here? Can I do, And so a lot of times I think it actually gets minimized and demeaned. So I'd love to like dig into that a little bit and what that could really look like.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the level at which affirmative consent gets sort of mocked and I think mostly deliberately misunderstood is when it gets treated as a technicality, right? So affirmative consent standards are encoded in a lot of college codes of conduct. They're encoded in the laws of Canada, right? Affirmative consent can be a legal standard, but even as such, it's representing an ethic about sex. And that's the level on which I like to relate to it, because when people are sort of hung up on the like legalistic rules-based idea about affirmative consent, it tends to be a conversation about like, how do I know I'm in the free to just do what I want, right? It's sort of like about how do I know which boxes to check so that I can have the sex I want and not have to worry about my partner too much, which is not a great mindset, honestly. What I'm really trying to do by shifting the affirmative consent standard is shift our moral and ethical standard to a place where I think if most people really took the time to reflect and checked in with themselves, they already really agree that we only want to be interacting sexually with people who are into it, right? That I think most people, if they really stopped to check in with themselves, would agree with that statement. I hope most people would. Again, it seems pretty basic and pretty much sort of just about affirming your partner's equal humanity. And affirmative consent is just a framework that helps you ensure you're doing what you probably already want to do if you stop and think about it. But we're so wrapped up, the dominant cultural narrative about sex is about getting it and giving it up and this sort of commodity exchange or this battle royale between the sexes. It's super heteronormative, right? And it's like this zero-sum game in which someone's a hero, usually a guy, and someone is like either like an uptight prude or is degraded by giving it up, right? Which is a woman. Whereas when we shift to an affirmative consent standard that says each of us is responsible, regardless of our gender or our partner's gender, for making sure that our partner is actively into what's happening the whole time we're interacting sexually. And if you can't tell, you have to ask, right? And what does that mean at root? It means that we have to show up. We have to be present for our partners. Doesn't mean you have to be married to them or have met them more than 2 minutes ago, right? But it does mean that you have to be present for your partner and that we have to learn how to verbally and non-verbally communicate better.
And that's a big gap for most people. I mean, people don't know how to do that.
And it's very reasonable because we don't see it modeled a lot of places.
No, there's nowhere where it's really modeled. I mean, very, unless you're like working with educators or people that are actively teaching that, we don't see it in movies. You don't see your parents negotiating their sexual lives. That would be inappropriate. And even if you did, they probably wouldn't be doing a great job of it because people don't know how. And in the US,
you don't get it in school.
Right.
You don't get any of that.
Yep.
So what I encounter is a lot of people who feel like talking about sex in that communicating boundaries way is inherently anti-sexy, which couldn't be further from the truth.
Oh my God, totally. Like, when did talking about sex become unsexy?
Only when it's like with the person you're actually doing it with. We're supposed to be thinking and talking about sex every other time,
right?
But when we're actually boning,
right?
Did you see Call Me by Your Name? The movie, did you see Call Me by Your Name?
Oh my God, it's one of the best movies I've ever seen.
Oh my God. And there's this one moment of consent in it, right? When they finally, spoiler alert, they kiss, right? Like, and when they're finally about to kiss for the first time, the older character says to the younger one, like, can I kiss you? In this, like, I almost just melted. Like I
Oh my
almost just
God.
disintegrated into a puddle. It was so sexy. So
It was
everyone I
so
feel like
good.
who thinks asking for affirming consent can't be sexy should just go watch Call Me by Your Name.
Yeah. Okay, so I lied. It does exist in one movie, at least, so far.
And it exists sometimes in sci-fi, so
Mm.
iZombie does a pretty good job with it because, and I think this is very important, in sci-fi, especially when you're having like a supernatural human sexual interaction, one's a supernatural being and one's a human, there's this inherent acknowledgement that one partner could really hurt the other partner and they need to talk about that. Right? So like this person is a zombie, right? Like you need to acknowledge the power dynamic there. But the reason, these monster stories are so popular is because we are all them, right? And so in reality, all of us could hurt our sex partners. All of us hurt that zombie.
I think that piece is really hard for people, and I think that that's actually part of the problem. What I've seen, and I work with a lot of women in particular, sometimes with men and definitely with queer folks. But I think a lot of times, like the men that are trying to be like the good guy, um, are avoiding looking at that part of themselves to such a degree that it ends up like almost emasculating their sexuality, which then ends up having this whole other host of problems that then come up in the sexual dynamic, and isn't satisfying either. And then there ends up being a lot of anger and resentment because sexual needs aren't being met. And then we're in a situation like right now where men are like, but I don't know how to ask for my needs and have that be okay. So I don't know what you've seen around that, but
I see that exact thing. That's sort of the men who are trying to not be sort of aggressively toxic men around sex sometimes way overcorrect, right? And are sort of very obsequious, which that may be your kink, but it may not be, right? There's somebody for everybody, but it doesn't have to be that way. It really just has to be. We just have to be able to talk about it, right? So it may be, and in fact is true for me, like I love a pretty aggressive sex partner. I do. Like but I can just tell them that. But a lot of guys I think have a hard time, the ones who've like worked really hard on themselves to make sure they're not being overly aggressive. Like they have a hard time figuring out where that line is. I think there's a lot of fear in men right now around approaching sex, and I really get that. On the one hand, I feel like, well, now you know how women have felt forever, right? It's sort of like unsure of whether you're coming across the right way and that the stakes are really high if you don't. Like, I know what that feels like, so I have a lot of empathy for it. But in actual interpersonal relationships, the only cure for it is communication.
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the things that I talk about a lot in my programs is that sex is always a negotiation.
Yeah.
It's always a negotiation. Whether you're showing up to the negotiation table in a good way is a whole other story, but if you think about like the way people negotiate sex, if you did that in business, you would just like, you would lose all your money. You would be like walked all over. If you like showed up to the negotiating table and you were like, whatever you want. Oh, sure. Yeah. Oh, yeah, sure. You want to make all the money and you get 95% and I get, sure. No problem. Yeah, I mean,
I'm just glad that you want to take money from me.
Yeah. Like that's not powerful, but I think that's how women in particular really show up. And so it's like how much that could like shift our approach if we're like, okay, like there's a negotiation here of like one person has needs, the other has needs. We're trying to find like where do those needs, where do they line up where we can have a win-win.
I mean, and it's not inherently an adversarial negotiation,
No,
right?
No, I think that word does have that connotation a little bit.
Yeah. That most of the time, I feel like if we approach it more like collaboration, we'd be better off, right? Like we're both trying to accomplish something together. We want to have a fun time, or we want this to be a profound connection, or whatever it is we want out of it, right? What is the shared goal that we can agree on? And then you're just talking about the details of like, how are we getting there and how are we doing it? And I think if you can approach sex from that sort of we could both be getting something great out of this together. We could be creating something together. It really transforms the whole interaction. But you know, those obstacles are, again, and I go back to sort of empowerment and individual versus systemic, like, and I know you know this, but women aren't showing up to those interactions like that just because women are silly and dumb, right? Mm-hmm. We've been systematically drilled into us from an astonishingly young age that our value is in being desired, not in having our own desire.
Yep.
That, you know, that's the highest thing we can aspire to. And good girls don't. And if you're a bad girl, you deserve to be raped, right? Like that we shouldn't have our own desires. It's actually quite terrifying for us to not only articulate, but pursue our own sexual desires. Mm-hmm. They're huge, because that also means we can articulate and pursue our own boundaries too, right? Yeah. There are huge penalties for that, and we see them every day. So we have to do that work on the individual level to get as free as we can. But, you know, this is what I'm arguing in Unscrewed. Ultimately, we can't just do this work on the individual level. Like, we have to change our cultural institutions, our media, our economy, our government, you know, all of these institutions, our sex ed, we have to shift them so that we're equipping girls and women to know that our pleasure is important, that we're living in a culture that tells girls and women that our pleasure is important, so that we feel like we have something to bring to the collaboration table.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, and I think like what you're saying, I see all the time in the women that I work with, like asking what do you really desire can be the scariest question. And people don't know how to answer it because there's been no practice of it. There's been no real permission to have it. And so then, of course, it's not happening in interpersonal relationships, which then means women are left to follow the sexuality of men in that heteronormative approach. I mean, I think we are absolutely conditioned to do that from the beginning, rather than to actually have a sense of like, there's something over here that is just mine. And even that idea of like, I want to do some work on my own sexuality apart from a partner can be weird sometimes for people.
One of the things I love to say is the most important sexual relationship any of us will ever have is the one we have with ourselves. Mm-hmm. And that's not a message you hear very often, unfortunately. Yeah. You know, when I was making What You Really, Really Want, my second book, which is kind of a adventure self-help book in figuring out what you want for yourself in terms of sex and how to navigate this in this messy culture we live in, I created this assignment that repeats throughout the book in the beginning of the book, where you are supposed to make a list of things that feel physically pleasurable and in an uncomplicated way. Like, that feels nice, and not that feels nice, but also I feel guilty, or that feels nice, but also is triggering, or, you know, those sorts of things. Like, just that feels physically pleasurable. And I workshopped everything in the book before I published it with an amazing group of 12 volunteers, women from just a wide range of experiences and identities, because I wanted to make sure all the exercises worked, right, of course. And they had just the hardest time with that exercise, just listing 5 or 10 things, like brushing your hair or walking barefoot through grass or taking a bath, like coming up with a list of like a toolbox full of things that just make you feel nice in your body. And I think that's not an accident. I think we as women are systemically alienated from our own desires and our own pleasures so that we can be in service to men's.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and that's a major underpinning of patriarchy, you know, and how patriarchy stays in place. So going back to the idea of affirmative consent, like, what are some like real life things that people could do, or ways that could look that isn't the corny version that, you know, I feel like people who make fun of it, you know, the way that it kind of has been, I guess,
where you like need depicted. A notary public to like touch
right, exactly,
boob. Yeah. Which, like, look, if the notary's consenting and everyone likes that, right, go right ahead. But yeah, look, the non-corny version of affirmative consent is just pay attention to your partner, and if you're unsure if they're into something, you have to ask them. That can mean like, does that feel good? Look, this is corny advice, but it's true. Just drop your voice an octave.
Oh, totally. Totally.
It just make your voice lower and everything sounds sexier.
Everything's
right?
sexier. I always teach that in Dirty Talk class.
Yeah. Or like, I really want to describe sex act here, like do you want that? Right? Like, you can get filthy with affirmative consent by describing before you do anything the thing you most want to do. It's incredibly erotic. And then the catch is you have to pay attention to your partner and whether or not they actually want you to do that.
Right.
The other thing that I think people get lost in is you absolutely can rely on body language to a certain extent for affirmative consent. You have to feel confident you're correctly reading someone's body language. So if you're with a sex partner who's new to you, you probably want to do more actual verbal talking as you go. But if you're with a partner where you feel really confident that you know what it looks like when they're having a good time and you know what it looks like when they're not sure or not having a good time, like, that's okay. Affirmative consent doesn't mean you're talking the entire time you're having sex. It just means you're paying attention and you want your partner to be enjoying what's happening between you, which, by the way, I think does describe most of us. I think that part of the hang up is that we're afraid to find out. And I think men especially are afraid to do all that checking in and asking because they might find out that their partners aren't enjoying everything. And that can be devastating if you have a really rigid idea of what it means to be a man, which includes like always being like maximally like pleasing a woman. You know, we're talking in very heteronormative terms here. You know, that's all tied up together. Can you please your woman and that sort of stuff? Yeah. And ironically, I think it's so scary to think that maybe in some moment you wouldn't be, that you wind up pretending you don't care at all. Like, it's sort of a very twisted logic, but I think a lot of people are afraid to find out if someone will say yes or no. And one of the things, have you had Karen BK Chan on?
No, but I've seen them speak before. Yeah.
Yeah, they're so brilliant. And one of the things that they are really brilliant about is talking about a desperate need to teach men emotional resiliency and how to deal with rejection, right? So if men were better equipped to hear, I don't want to do that with you right now, or possibly even I don't want to do that with you ever, and not hear that as sort of like an assault on your identity, then I think that we would also have much better sexual negotiations inherently as well. But that we teach men that like winning and getting your way is everything. And we don't set up men to understand that like what I might want or not want in any given moment isn't a referendum on your value as a human person. So I think there's a lot of emotional literacy work to do with people of all genders around sexual communication, but men have this extra piece where like any kind of rejection can just feel mortal, like a mortal wound. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think in general, people don't like to feel rejected sexually. I mean, it's like we're putting ourselves out there in a vulnerable way. I mean, I think the two greatest fears people have around sex are the fear of being judged and the fear of being rejected. And of course, the fear of being judged starts with like the way we're judging ourselves constantly before we can even experience it externally.
But, and affirmative consent opens us to both things, right?
Right. Right.
Because, you know, that doesn't feel good is also can feel like judgment, or, you know, like you might find out stuff that makes you feel judged, and definitely that might make you feel rejected. And so it is an extra level of vulnerability.
Yeah. Yeah. And then there's just like people understanding some of the myths about sex and sexuality, that, you know, the same thing's going to work on all your partners. And that, so, but that worked great with my last girlfriend. Like, why is that not like the magic thing here? You know, and so I think like a lot of those myths too around with each new partner, you have to figure out what their pathways are and what their turn-ons are. And it's not going to be the same as your last three or, you know, it is, we again, there are all these ways that we then bypass having to communicate.
And having to recognize that's a individual human person you're interacting with, right? Like, I really think of my project as like rehumanizing sex, you know, and having sex that affirms and recognizes everybody's basic humanity. And I know that winds up sounding kind of woo for people, but I think it's really important that because the alternative is having dehumanizing sex, which is a lot of what's happening.
Yeah. So speaking of dehumanizing, let's talk about, I really want to hear you talk about what happened with Facebook, because you really, you took on Facebook in a way that I mean, first of all, thank you. Kudos. I can say, as a sex educator who is not putting porn into the world and is trying to just put good messages into the world, it's very hard to deal with Facebook.
I mean, it still is. We certainly didn't fix Facebook.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about what happened and why you founded Women Action in the Media?
Sure. I founded Women Action in the Media. It grew out of a project that I was already working for called Center for New Words, which actually grew out of a feminist bookstore. So it's a long feminist literary cultural evolution. But when I launched WHAM as its own endeavor, one of my ideas for it was that it should be a grassroots action network. That there's so many institutions that need to change when it comes to women in media, and that we could all work together to exert our pressure. There are a lot of us. And so I was looking for kind of an inaugural launch action for that project, the Direct Action Project. And I knew at the time that the issue of just content that absolutely glorified and made light of violence against women was all over Facebook, right? Memes, with like a woman pushed down the stairs and some vile headline, and like just incredibly disgusting, vile memes everywhere. And if you would report them, you would get told that they were controversial humor. And so that it was fair game. And so I talked to Soraya Shamali, who wound up collaborating with me on the action and who was on my board at WHAM, because I knew she had done some writing about it, and there had been a petition that had like 200,000 signatures. Facebook didn't even respond to it. And I said to her, like, what do you think is the next step here? Activists have been working on this for years. We know that they don't care about even 200,000 of their own users saying, hey, this is not kosher. What do you think is the next step? And she looped in Laura Bates from Everyday Sexism in the UK, who had some really limited success experimenting with targeting advertisers, saying, hey, advertiser, do you know what content your ad is appearing next to on Facebook? Don't you like appealing to women? And having those advertisers say, oh my God, I had no idea my ad was appearing next to that. That's horrifying. We'll look at it. And so from that, we developed the idea of having a targeted advertiser campaign, and we picked 5 of their biggest advertisers who clearly valued their female customers. We picked Dove, Amex, Zipcar, Vistaprint. I don't remember what the 5th one was. And we also reached out to 20, 30 other women's rights and anti-sexual violence organizations so that we would have a huge international coalition ready from the moment we went go. And we published this open letter, and we launched the hashtag, and we asked people basically, and we had taken all these screenshots of advertisers with their content next to really vile stuff. And we basically targeted the advertisers and said, Dove, you're supposed to care about women. You're advertising next to this vile content. Will you commit to not advertise on Facebook until they fix this? And what wound up happening was, first of all, it blew up instantly beyond our wildest dreams. I think there were 60,000 tweets on the hashtag in a week. In addition to many thousands of emails and phone calls. It was huge. And the media, it became sort of its own media firestorm, which is great for us. And what we found out, none of the big advertisers we targeted actually pulled their ads, but what we found, although a bunch of smaller advertisers, once they saw the furor, sort of capitalized by saying, we'll stop advertising on Facebook, and we kept a running list of those. But those big advertisers were negotiating behind the scenes, right? They were calling up their contacts in Facebook and being like, this cannot keep happening. And it was literally a week from the day we launched, Facebook capitulated. Which was amazing. It was amazing.
Yeah, that's pretty unusual.
Faster than we had ever expected. Now, I hasten to say that some unintended things happened after that, including Facebook cracked down on a bunch of BDSM sites, BDSM pages on Facebook, because the moderators were just told anything that depicts violence against women, and they were not trained in how to read context. So Facebook remains kind of a mess. I think some of those got resolved along the way, but I'm sure Facebook also presently has a ban against running ads that acknowledge that sex is pleasurable.
Oh, I mean, it's very hard for me to get an ad through, and I don't have anything explicit. My brand is like very accessible. And we've been in battle with them. I mean, we've gotten letters from them. We actually have gotten some responses, but it's like, there's no nuance at all.
There's no nuance. And it's also, I mean, one of the big problems at Facebook, I mean, there's numerous problems, but one of them is that they don't really invest in moderation. So the moderators, A, have no training in context or nuance, right? And also B, they have 20 seconds or something crazy to make a decision when something is reported or flagged. And so it depends on which moderator you get on which day as to what's going to happen also. Content that was fine last week is suddenly taken down. There was also a whole separate fight that finally got won that Soraya helped out with about like it being okay to show women breastfeeding, even if it shows a little nipple. So Facebook, the issue with Facebook is a really great illustration of how, we can't just decide to be free. Like there's this private company founded and owned by largely like this one white guy and his white guy friends, right? Who are deciding what is okay for us to communicate about when it comes to sex. You can run an ad on Facebook that says you should wear a condom because if you don't, you'll get a disease and your dick will fall off. But you can't run an ad that says you should wear a condom because you'll be able to relax and enjoy yourself more and sex should be fun. And research shows, and I'm sure you know this, I'm preaching to the choir, that actually that second message, the pleasure-driven message, is much more effective at getting people to use condoms. Yeah. So I've never been able to get a straight answer from them about why specifically, and it's very clear in their ad rules that you can't acknowledge that sex is pleasurable. It's bonkers. It's so bonkers. And look, they're perfectly capable of age gating those ads, right? If they wanted to say you can advertise whatever you want, but not to someone under 18, they could even do an opt-in where like, even if you're over 18, you have to say, I want to see adult ads, right? They could do any number of things in a heartbeat. They already have the functionality. They've decided this is the best for their business model. I don't really know why. I think it's probably because they do business in a lot of conservative countries and it's just more politically easy for them. And they don't understand the harm it's doing because it's a bunch of white guys who already have their sexuality centered everywhere else in the culture and they don't need it.
Yeah. Well, and I have a friend that was successful in she started following like Maxim's page and like those kinds of pages and looking at the kinds of things that they were putting out. And then she was able to make some pretty good arguments with them and make some headway in getting some of her things through that were really about like empowered sexuality and healthy sexuality. But yeah, I mean, I got a letter from one of their moderators. We sort of miraculously got responses where we kept saying, why was this disapproved? Why was this disapproved?
And most of the time you get nothing.
Yeah, so it was kind of a miracle. But he wrote the most detailed letter. It's hilarious. And he basically went down these bullet points of, well, you published a book called Lesbian Sex Secrets for Men. And in that book, you talked about anal sex and polyamory. And which I was just like, so anal sex, polyamory. Okay. He had trolled my website. He, found things that he was like, on your homepage, the word sex shows up, 79 times or something, but most of them were sexuality, sent me a screenshot with all of them highlighted. I mean, it was like, this guy spent some time like trolling me to prove to me how unfit I was for Facebook. I was like,
because you talk about anal sex and polyamory.
In a book I wrote 15 years ago. But, I mean, he had to go to Amazon to find that, So anyway, which there's nothing wrong with that anyway. But it's just it's like no matter, I mean, he literally looked at my entire body of work, which had nothing to do.
He had that kind of time, honestly.
Yeah. Well, I offered him free coaching. I said, I really want to offer this to you. I would love to help you because I think there's some repression and some things happening here that I could really help you with. He didn't take me up on it, but, offer still holds, Daniel, at Facebook. I'll still help you.
That is beautiful. I love that.
So anyway, but yeah, I mean, it is an interesting window just into the larger culture, and some of the, some of the dynamics that, I mean, it's like we can see it so much more immediately and clearly through social media now in a way that we didn't before. So I'm curious, just talking about kind of this moment that we're in right now. We've had the Me Too and the Time's Up, and there's a lot of things coming to the surface. And, you know, I'm old enough that I've seen this cycle a couple times. I think you've probably seen it. And so I think there can be a lot of skepticism in people of like, are things just going to get swept under the rug again? It's like things kind of erupt, and then it's like, you know, we just like push that to the side and then we can move on. And then it's still sexism as usual, and sexual violence as usual. So do you think that this is a different moment, or what do you think is notable about what's happening right now?
I think the number of powerful men who've lost their jobs is different than what I've seen before. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's systemic change yet, but it still gives me hope.
Yeah.
I do think that we're still having this narrative where we're following this sort of soap opera style. So like a story about one person or a series of stories about one person will crop up. And then the question is, well, what's going to happen to that person? And blah, 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 blah. And then something happens or doesn't happen. And then that story is considered over. In that we're not really, I mean, look, in places you're seeing it, but that as a culture, we're not quite getting down to the systems level yet. Like, how is it that all of these stories are so similar? What are the systems that are enabling it? What changes do we need to make? Some people are having those conversations, but some people were having those conversations before Me Too became very popular this last fall, right? Yeah. Like, it's not like we weren't doing the work before then. So I do have a little frustration with kind of the way that the reporting is mostly happening, which is like this pop your popcorn and sort of follow along. Look, you know, I'm all for abusive, powerful men getting their downfall, and I pop a little popcorn for that too. But we're not going to interrupt that cycle until we talk about, like, how did that desk button come to be installed in Matt Lauer's desk, right? Mm-hmm. And how is it that so many of these stories were quote unquote open secrets for so long? And how do open secrets function, and why do they function in these instances? Why was it thought that it was a better investment to allow someone like Lauer or Weinstein to keep operating and abusing women than to address it? Like, why was that even seen as more profitable or, you know, a worthwhile exchange? What are the motivating factors there, and how can we shift those power dynamics? But I do feel like I honestly, when the Weinstein story came out, I had never thought about Harvey Weinstein that much, but it came out and I thought, yeah, that doesn't surprise me. Mm-hmm. And I expected it to go away in a couple of days, because it seemed like such an unsurprising story to me. Mm-hmm. Powerful Hollywood man abuses women. Like, mm-hmm. I hate to sound so cynical, but, you know, if you've been doing this work for long enough, you're like, yep.
Yeah,
that is true.
That's so unusual.
Right, exactly. I didn't know that suddenly people would care.
Right.
And I'm thrilled that they do. And I think we can learn from what I think is making the difference in this moment that it has sustained for so long. One, I think that the reporters on that original story and on most of the stories since then have done something smart and I think different than in the past, which is they reported out the story from a bunch of women simultaneously so that they didn't make one woman stand up against this powerful man. It was sort of a group of women and a group of stories, all of which echoed each other. And I thought that was really powerful and smart and carefully, thoughtfully done in a way that reporting about sexual violence has not always been. You know, if you think about the Cosby case, for example, he's got however many dozens of women alleging he sexually assaulted them or raped them. But we heard their stories one at a time throughout the decades. And most of us didn't even wind up hearing those stories because they came out one at a time. It was only when that all got re-reported and we saw like the pattern that it was like, oh, you know, I'd love to ask the question, why don't we believe one woman? But, you know, until we're in that culture, having groups of women standing together, I think is really powerful and is part of what's shifting here. I do also think that one of the elements is that a lot of people are horrified that there is a sexual predator in the White House. Mm. And we can't do anything about that right now, but we can do that about other sexual predators.
Yeah.
That was a shock, a moral shock to see him be elected, and those allegations go completely unaddressed, and that there's a bottled up outrage that is being expressed in other ways. So it's a skitsy moment, right? Where like, time's up for all these powerful men except the president. And Rob Porter and whoever else. I guess time is up for Rob Porter. But so I think that we can learn from the dynamics of what's happening right now. Do I think eventually the furor will die down? I do. I think human people can only focus on one story as news for so long. But I do think it's less like, then we will go back to normal, as like we'll have taken a step forward.
Mm-hmm.
I got asked infinity times this past fall, like, is this a tipping point? Are we at a tipping point? Is everything going to be different now? And I just think it's the wrong question. I just don't think that's how social change works. I lived through the Anita Hill hearings. They happened as I was graduating college, and everyone was like, now sexual harassment will be addressed. And obviously that didn't happen. But what did happen was reports to the EEOC like quadrupled about sexual harassment, and a lot of women ran for Senate, and some things did change, right? Things are not the same as before Anita Hill spoke up. So will there be some backsliding? Is there already a ton of backlash? Sure. Does that mean this means nothing and it's just a blip? Not at all. So I think progress is being made. I just think progress is frustratingly glacial.
Yeah. 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 I mean,
non-linear. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I love that Anita Hill is still around to actually see this, and to, it's been really awesome actually to watch her be really honored for the contribution she made, which was a huge contribution. I mean, I remember those hearings. I was in college as well. And I mean, that was a watershed. And just the way she was treated, and yeah. So yeah, she's now heading, I think, the commission that Time's Up put together in Hollywood.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
It's fantastic. Like, talk about getting to see some of your work come full circle in a way.
And to tie that back into faux empowerment, I think part of how we backslid after Anita Hill from sort of the need for systemic change around sexual harassment is by focusing on individual women's power, right? And so there was this narrative and sort of like the you go girl power. I'm not talking about riot girl power, but when it gets co-opted by the Spice Girls and the Pussycat Dolls even, right? It starts to be about individual women's power. And I think that when that translates into the workplace, it means you're supposed to be like the cool girl, right? You're supposed to be tough and self-contained. And if somebody's being gross about sex, like, that's supposed to be no big deal to you, right? You're supposed to brush it off. And that's why, when you hear people say, well, why did they take so long to come forward? I think in part is because we tell women they can just decide to empower themselves. And what that means is we wind up eating a lot of abuse and pretending we're cool with it. That's what individual self-empowerment, like, that's not where it's meant. I think that a lot of people who say we should just be more powerful, like, mean it really well. But when we focus on the individual being more powerful instead of all of us together, we get isolated from each other, right? And we don't say, hey, this is really messing with me. Is it messing with you? Oh, you have a story just like mine? You also feel horrible? Because we're supposed to be tough and strong and already empowered.
Yeah. And I've been talking about this a lot lately, is, really there's such a need for us to look at both. It's like we can't just do the individual work and not also do the collective work. And we can't just do the collective work and not do the work right here with that sexual relationship,
Yeah. I mean, because in the meantime, we are still living our lives in this mess, right? And we still deserve to have the best lives we can, and that involves doing our own homework with ourselves. Yeah.
And learning skills to navigate our relationships better and to stand up for ourselves better. And, that's a lot of what I see in the women that come out of come out of this work with that I do. You know, and I think a lot of times they're surprised at how much it impacts them in all areas of their lives. They're like, I thought I was coming here to work on sex, and you know, we did, but this was really about like all these other things, because it's really about our personal power and how we're showing up and claiming that and really owning it.
But I think one of the ways that we can really find our personal power is also by learning that we're not crazy, right? That things that bother us are real and valid, and we have a right to object to them, right? And that people who are hurting us are really hurting us, and that we shouldn't just be tough enough that it doesn't hurt us. That's actually stepping into your personal power. And so I find that, honestly, for me, talking about and peeling back the layers of these systems that really do impinge upon our sex lives and our lives in general, because they're not separable. I totally agree with you. That seeing them for what they are makes me actually feel more powerful and less crazy, because I'm not internalizing all of that and feeling like it's my fault. And that if I don't feel fully powerful, it's because I haven't, you know, that's on me. Instead, I can be like, no, actually, I'm angry because this is messed up and needs to change. And in the meantime, I feel good about me because that bullshit is not for me.
Yeah, and I think one of the other interesting pieces of this conversation that has been raised repeatedly recently that's been very helpful is the way that gaslighting is used and is a tool of toxic masculinity and of patriarchy to continually tell women, like, no, that's not happening. Like, what are you talking about? And it is that, like, crazy making, like, am I crazy? Like, did maybe, you know, and I think keeping us in that place of just second guessing ourselves constantly, then keeps us, of course, then we're not going to claim like power in a bigger way, because we're over here completely questioning ourselves and in our own insecurity. And, you know, that has been used systemically.
There's like a cultural gaslighting that tells us we are the only things in our own way. And so if we're not feeling really fully liberated, we feel like, oh, I must be broken.
And I mean, I hear that word all the time. Women use that word all the time. They feel broken. And I think it, you know, and it relates to, I wrote about this in my book, it really relates to this approach about sexuality of like, that it's this thing outside of us, it's this thing we barter that we're going to give away to someone, or that someone took from us, or there's this missing piece, you know, all the ways that it gets talked about in that language really makes it this thing that like isn't us. And so really it's like coming home to like what is that homecoming around sexuality that really is inherent in me. And that's just such a different way of being in relationship and in the world that I think unless you've done the work, most people don't know what that feels like.
Yeah. Well, and also that you can... Look, we all have places of hurt and injury around our sexuality and ourselves. And that but we can bring those too. We can be our whole selves in our sexuality. And that we can even find strength in the broken places, right? We can be strong in the broken places. We can sort of say, this gives me a kind of empathy that makes me a better partner, or I've learned what I won't put up with anymore, or, you know, like all of those injuries are also us in some way, and that they have changed us in ways that maybe we would not wish upon ourselves, but are still here, and we can turn them, we can use them and bring them with our whole self into our sexuality. And it gets back to sort of like the idea of humanizing sex, right? And you want, if you're having partner sex, also a partner who has space for all of that complexity. Yeah. I mean, and maybe you turn that into kink play, or, you know, there's all kinds of stuff you can do with your hurt places in sex. If you have the opportunity, if you get to be a human being, a full human being in your sexuality.
Yeah. I wouldn't be sitting here if it weren't for those places for me. I don't know that you would be from what you said. So, you
100%.
know, so, I mean, I think a lot of people go into this work because of those hurt places too. So there's a lot of transformative work that can happen. Love talking to you. So as we, you know, I guess just as we close out in the next few minutes, what's your vision in terms of like where, I mean, your book really came out at such a perfect time. I mean, you couldn't have planned it better.
Oh my God. You know what's funny is Trump was elected, I was like, oh, I guess this book is garbage now. Cause like, who's going to care about a vision of a better sexual future when we're fighting for just to not go backwards? But it did turn out to be perfect timing.
Yeah. And with everything that's happening, I mean, so yeah, what's your hope for liberation movements and for that new paradigm of sexual liberation in terms of where we're going, or what do you want to see in the coming months? Or is there a call to action you'd like to give our viewers?
I mean, the call to action is really, Unscrewed lays out a bunch of different institutions and places where we need intervention. And it also introduces a whole bunch of people doing, I think, great work to make those interventions. And my hope is that people learn that doing the work to make the sexual culture more humane and more a safer place for all of us to stand in our power, can look an infinity different ways. And what I just want from people is to not accept the status quo as given, right? The sexual culture we live in is created by people, and we could create a different one. And so what I most dearly want from people is not to give in to helplessness. And if the idea of changing the sexual culture feels too large and overwhelming, make it smaller until you feel like you can do something. Pick a piece, pick masculinity or sex education or the way capitalism interacts with sex or the media or whatever it is, and then make a goal small enough that you feel like you can make an impact on it, even just in your own friend group or community. And if all of us do that, then we really are having each other's backs and creating in a world where we all will be genuinely more sexually powerful.
Yeah. And I do want to say that really, I got that in your book so clearly. Like, I loved the stories of the different women and just people that are working towards liberation in these very different ways. Some of them are people that I know, and some of them were really new to me, and their work was new to me. So it really was hopeful in that it's like you linked it, you linked these, all these, like, it's like there's these different pieces of work going on, and that's really what the collective work is about. Like, we can't change the whole big thing. Like, pick your thing and work towards that and find your people, find your tribe,
So I think for me, I'm going to be drilling down probably in the next few years on changing the way we do sex ed in the US. But that's not what I think the one true path is, right? I think that exactly, find your tribe, find the thing that you feel passionate about, that you feel like you have something to contribute. And the other, I have a little guide in the back about like things I've learned about organizing along the way. And one of them is like, not everyone needs to be a leader. You can also just pick an issue you care about and contact someone who's doing good work in that area and say, how can I help? Right? You don't have to invent a project. Yes. Everybody who's doing this work needs help.
Yes. Thank you for that.
Don't feel like you have to invent a new project. In fact, one of the best things you can do is just get involved with something that you really think is good that is already happening.
For sure.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being a part of this and all your wisdom and all your work in the world. If people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to stay in touch?
I'm on Twitter at Jaclyn F, Jaclynf, and on Instagram, which is more sort of behind the scenes-y, Jaclyn Effable, Jaclynfable. Or you can visit me on my website. There's a contact form there. I get all the emails. And there's also stuff about live events I'm doing coming up and writing, and all of my stuff is at jaclynfriedman.com, and Friedman is Friedman.
Awesome. We will definitely
thank you
post all of that.
Yeah, this is a lot of fun. I hope we'll keep talking, and thanks for including me. I'm really excited to participate in this with you. You're doing such wonderful work.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yay, fellow kindred spirit. I love it. So, and I just think, So everyone, thank you so much for being here. And if you loved this talk, or if you want to revisit it, there were so many pearls of wisdom. I'm sure many people are going to want to hear this again. You can bring all of the talks home, and there's lots of bonuses and other things that you can do around this conference. And I hope that people will really connect through this conference also with some projects and some ways of actually taking that collective action in the world. So just go to rachelgoddard.com/sexpowerleadership, and you can get all the info there. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and I will see you in the next talk.